whether the Supreme Court is a barking dog that never bites. Wonderful, wonderful question. I will provide what I would want to argue as a critical analysis of the Supreme Court orders and their implementation in as far as Uganda is concerned. First of all, Uganda's Supreme Court is no doubt the highest appellate court in the country. And it starts with upholding the Constitution and delivering what they call binding decisions. However, concerns have actually been raised about non-implementation of Supreme Court rulings, raising questions about whether it's a barking dog that never bites. And obviously, this analysis will try to create by way of legal authority in light of the Supreme Court, in light of enforcement of its orders, in light of judicial precedents, in terms of the systematic weaknesses that may hinder the compliancy of what we are trying to analyze or decipher today. And that is what I am tasked to explain to you. And I will respond to your questions in this way. Number one, you asked me a question, I'll reiterate the question. What is the legal status of the Supreme Court ruling in Uganda? And I'll argue this way. From a constitutional base, in light of what is expected for us to know, one thing you must understand is that the Constitution of Uganda, especially as we refer to it in the 1995 Constitution, under Article 132, establishes the Supreme Court as what? As the highest judicial authority in Uganda. The operative word here is what? Highest. When you argue in light of Article 92, it prohibits Parliament from passing laws that alter or nullify court decisions, reaffirming the finality of the authority of the Supreme Court as far as the judgments are concerned. When you argue that in light of Article 126, judicial power must be exercised in conformity with the laws and the values of justice. And I will back up my arguments in light of case law so that I can contextualize what we are talking about. Let us argue Attorney General versus the Influenza, which was a 1997 case. The Supreme Court ruled that government agencies must comply with judicial orders, but enforcement, unfortunately, remains an issue. If you look at another case, Amama Mbabazi versus Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, 2016, the Supreme Court made recommendations to improve electoral processes, but many were actually ignored by Parliament and even the Electoral Commission. That is a big question. Perhaps that's why you're getting this rhetoric, whether or not Supreme Court decisions are actually simply barking dog that never bites. Now, Supreme Court rulings are legally binding and must be implemented. Failure to comply undermines the rule of law and judicial independence. And that is something that you need to comprehend. When you look at one of my books, somewhere here in my library, it talks about the executive mandate in terms of demystifying the constitutional executive mandate. Sometimes when the executive oversees the authority, or perhaps when the judiciary becomes more executive-minded than the executive itself. But the question is, who's responsible for implementing Supreme Court rulings, and why do they fail to act? Perhaps that's another question in light of what you want me to comprehend. Number one, we have some substantive key institutions that are responsible for implementation. And one of that is the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General, as the chief legal advisor of government, the AG is responsible for ensuring the executive agencies comply with court rulings. Very, very important. Number two, the executive branch itself, the president and cabinet, must ensure that government compliance with court orders, not the other way around. Number three, Parliament must pass laws or amendments to reflect Supreme Court decisions when needed. And that is substantially important. So all these things are super important. Number 4, law enforcement agencies, for example, the police, the DPP, are also responsible for, executing court orders, especially in light of criminal matters, so that we can align ourselves with what? Court decisions. And what are some of the reasons that we may have for non-implementations? You could argue in terms of political interference as one of the substantive reasons. Some Supreme Court rulings challenge government actions, leading to executive reluctance to comply. And that is something, again, you must comprehend from the word go. And another thing that you may probably want to argue is in light of what they call lack of enforcement mechanism. The Constitution provides no direct enforcement powers to the judiciary, which is another big problem that we need to comprehend again in terms of not letting it be simply a barking dog. And then you could argue in terms of institutional weaknesses. There should be agencies responsible for implementation. For example, Electoral Commission, the police. These often lack resources or even political will to do as they are required to do. And that becomes another big problem in terms of failing to implement Supreme Court decisions. Now, I will support my arguments in light of what they call cases that are probably played out in terms of non-implementation. If you look at Besige versus Electoral Commission, which was 2001, the Supreme Court ruled on election irregularities, but government has actually ignored these reforms. And that is something that you may want to look at and comprehend. Look at another case, Uganda Law Society versus Attorney General, which was 2009. The Supreme Court invalidated parts of the Anti-Terrorism Act, but the government continued applying the law. Again, another challenge in light of failing to implement some of its decisions. So why wouldn't someone simply say, wait a minute, isn't this simply a barking dog that never bites? The argument here is that the failure to implement Supreme Court decisions is due to the executive inertia, weak enforcement mechanism, and lack of what they call political will. And these are things you must comprehend from the word go. So even as you argue and trying to contextualize the debate in light of whether or not the Supreme Court or any other judicial for that purpose is simply a barking dog that never bites, we could also look at some of the consequences for failing to implement Supreme Court rulings. What do you think are the likely consequences? I would argue that problem number 1 would be what they call the illusion of judicial authority. At my undergrad, I did something on, in my dissertation, in light of what they call mob justice, because I noticed there was a lacuna of the failure for perhaps the police or institutions to implement. So ignoring rulings undermines public trust in the judiciary. And this creates, that mistrust, continuous mistrust, and causing loss of faith in the system. And then violation of the rule of law is another aspect. Non-compliance with judicial decisions actually leads to constitutional crises, and that becomes a serious problem. Way back from historically speaking, we have had challenges in terms of such, constitutional crises that are simply, an offshoot of failure to oblige with the rule of law. And then engagement in terms of encouraging what they call impunity. Yeah, when government agencies, for example, refuse to comply, it actually emboldens others to ignore legal implications because they're like, who gives a damn? These things don't bite after all, So if we don't have a culture of implementing these substantive decisions, I borrow an example from the US, for example, the change of government from Biden to Trump, even though they are cat and mouse, but substantially they have to agree because constitutional provisions do order them to do so. If you argue in terms of presidential election petition, for example, as examples that have been played out. Amama Mbabazi, for example, versus Museveni in 2016, the Supreme Court issued 10 key electoral reforms, including transparency in voter registration. But to date, many recommendations remain unimplemented, leading to similar complaints in 2021 elections. So again, why wouldn't someone say, look, there is this big dog that barks, that never bites? So these are questions that are fundamental to the proper rule of law and constitutionalism in our country. And if we fail to address them, we are finding ourselves and digging ourselves deeper in a ditch that we will find difficult to get ourselves out. Obviously, the question is, in light of your other question, is that what measures can actually be undertaken to strengthen the enforcement of Supreme Court orders, for example. I would argue, in terms of what they call legal and institutional reforms as a remedy, I would argue and say we need amendment of the Constitution and substantive amendments that this time will stay and not be taken over by a whim of a few handshakes. We need to introduce provisions allowing direct enforcement of Supreme Court decisions, similar to Kenya's approach under Article 261 of the Kenyan Constitution, for example. Yeah? Because when we do that, when we entrench the Constitution with such fundamental aspects, then we can be able to know that we have created a system that your great-grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, will take joy or pride in knowing that we have safety and continuity. We need to have sanctions for non-compliance, for example. Officials, for example, who ignore Supreme Court rulings should face penalties, including removal from office. And these are questions that we need to comprehend. And it would happen in any modern democracy, by the way. I mean, you saw what happened in the likes of Trump, the first term, when he was a little bit dodgy when it came to leaving power. You saw what happened. The Constitution had to preside, not so. Then we need to argue in terms of what they call judicial review processes, strengthening judicial oversights over government compliance, including the power to summon non-compliant officials, is another substantive and fundamental important aspect. When you look at my book, Demystifying the Executive Constitutional Mandate, I make those provisions, including the impeachability of individuals like the president. We see this in countries like America, where people like Donald Trump, people like other ex-presidents, have Clinton, for example, have been impeached, And then public awareness in terms of advocacy. Civil society and legal institutions should actually pressure the government to actually respect these court decisions. Yeah? I mean, the Uganda Law Society and Parliament should actually regularly audit Supreme Court compliance. Yeah? We should have substantive, validated audit organs that can audit Supreme Court compliance. Yeah? And the final verdict, in my opinion, is the Supreme Court, yes, maybe a barking dog that never bites, but it has substantive reasons why perhaps it never bites. Yeah? So while the Supreme Court issues binding rulings, the failure of enforcement mechanisms makes it, powerless. So it is not a failure of the court itself, but rather a failure of the executive and the legal enforcement agencies to strengthen these judicial authority. So my argument here is that Uganda must implement constitutional and institutional reforms, ensuring full compliance with the Supreme Court directions. And then those are some of the questions. Now, to use my arguments in light of Luganda, justification, because you asked me to say a little bit in Luganda. I wish you had asked in Lusoga, but I still say in Luganda. Kulemererwa kw'ebiragiro ebya constitution ya Uganda okuba nti ekola nga bwe yandigwanyidde okukola, nti okuba nti eringa embwa ereekaana obuleekaanyi naye nga teruma, ebiseera ebisinga tekiva ku kooti yo nga yo, wabula ebyo ebikwatagana ne sisitimu yaffe nga gavumenti. Gavumenti yaffe emenyebwa mu biti bisatu: executive, legislature ne judiciary. Ebiti ebyo bisatu byonna birina okukwatagana. Singa wabaawo ekiti ekimu ekisinga kinnakyamaanyi kijja kwesanga nti kyekisinga ate okulemesa kiri ekirala. Walina okubaawo clear separation of powers, okuba nti buli kitongole oba buli ogani yonna eri independent, ganaabanga amayinja asatu okwesa ebigambo bya Professor Kanyehamba oba nga Dr. Onulia bwe tusomesa